The holding cell smelled like copper and burnt circuitry, and Cale Ryan had stopped noticing both a long time ago. He sat in the corner with his back against the wall, and his knees drawn up and his eyes closed, doing the thing he'd taught himself to do in the months since capture. Counting his own heartbeats, not to calm himself, to remember he was still producing them, 63, 64, 65. Each one a small act of defiance against everything the Kethvoran Empire had decided about the human species. The cell block was 12 pods wide and 4 deep, each one sealed with a translucent membrane that let the guards see in without letting the occupants see out in any useful way. Distortion fields. Everything in a Kethvoran facility was designed to disorient. The light shifted through spectra human eyes couldn't quite parse, cycling through frequencies that made the brain unsure whether it was morning or night, Tuesday or 6 months later. Cale had watched newer captives go soft in 3 weeks from that alone. He was on his 11th round. That was what the handlers called it. A round. Not a fight, not a match. A round, as though it were a game of something civilized. Cale had killed 7 beings in the mortality games. 3 of them had been human. He didn't let himself forget any of their faces. The membrane rippled and a guard pressed something flat and luminescent against the exterior. The usual feeding procedure. A tray of nutrient paste materialized through the membrane and settled on the floor, and Cale opened his eyes and looked at it without moving. Rin, the voice was barely a sound. It came from the cell to his left, through the thin seam where 2 membrane walls met at their edges. The seam was imperfect. The Kethvoran built everything to last 10,000 years, but they had trouble with the concept that imprecision could be useful. Cale had found the seam on his 3rd day in this pod. "Ryan, you awake?" "No," he said, "the Lowell is dead." A pause. "They found him this morning in the exercise yard. Neck injury. The handlers are saying he fell." Cale was quiet. The Lowell had been in the games for 6 rounds. He'd had a kind of bioelectric field that crackled when he was angry, and one of the most genuinely terrifying laughs Cale had ever heard. He'd been from a colony called Marin's Gate that the Kethvoran had glassed 18 months before Cale's own colony fell. "He didn't fall," Cale said. "No, he was talking to someone. Someone the handlers wanted him not to talk to." Another pause, and then the voice dropped even lower. So low Cale had to tip his head sideways and hold very still. "Someone on the outside." Cale said nothing. He picked up the nutrient paste and started eating it. He'd learned early that refusing food was a gesture, and gestures cost calories, and calories kept you upright in the arena. "There's a network," the voice continued. "It's been running for 4 months. Humans and some allied species, coordinated through signal bursts on the maintenance frequency. The Kethvoran don't monitor it because they use it for waste heat dispersal. Whoever's running it figured that out." A pause that sounded like admiration. "She figured a lot of things out. She, Commander Mira Solis. You know the name?" Cale ate his paste. 3rd Colonial Marines. "She was at Kessler Station when it fell. She walked out of Kessler Station with 43 people. The number sat in the cell between them. Kessler Station had held 4,000. 43 out was a catastrophe by any sane metric. Cale had heard it described 3 different ways, by 3 different people who'd been there. And every version ended the same. The orbital bombardment. The environmental seals blowing. The Kethvoran ground troops moving through the corridors with that particular slow confidence of a species that had done this 800 times before. 43 out of 4,000. By another metric entirely, the metric of what that environment meant for survival. 43 was a number that made the back of your neck prickle. "What does she want with someone in the games?" Cale asked. "Not just you. She's been contacting fighters across 4 facility clusters. Says she's building something." The membrane seam hummed faintly. The guard was making another pass along the corridor. Both men went silent, and still until the footsteps faded. "She says the games are running across 42 star systems. The Kethvoran broadcast them as proof." "Proof of what?" "That humans are animals, that we fight and kill each other for spectacle. That there's no civilization worth preserving, no resistance worth taking seriously." Cale could hear the thing the man on the other side of the membrane was working very hard not to let into his voice. They show it on every habitation platform in the Empire. It's their justification. Their whole story about what we are. Cale set the empty tray on the floor and looked at the ceiling. The light was doing its frequency shift, pulsing through something close to violet that made his temples ache. He'd learned to stare through it rather than at it, something his mother had told him once about looking at a thing at an angle when looking straight at it didn't work. She'd been talking about stars, the dim ones you could only see in peripheral vision. He'd been 7 years old, and they'd been lying in the grass outside their colony module, and the sky had been genuinely, beautifully dark. "Tell her," Kale said, "that I need to know how she's getting the signal in." The next round was scheduled for 3 days out. In the mortality games, the matchups were determined by an algorithm the Keth-Voran called the Harmony Index, a name that struck Kale as either deeply ironic or exactly on the nose, depending on your interpretation of harmony. It weighed variables like bioelectric output, recorded physical performance, estimated stress thresholds, and something the handlers described as narrative compatibility, which KL understood to mean they paired fighters in ways that would generate the most compelling broadcast. The audience wanted stories. Even an alien audience, it turned out, wanted to feel something watching two creatures try to kill each other. He'd been using that for 6 rounds without anyone noticing. The games had rules. No conventional weapons. No Keth-Voran technology introduced into the arena. The fighters used what they had: their bodies, their abilities, their ingenuity. For humans specifically, the Keth-Voran commentators liked to note the absence of any obvious combat adaptations. No natural armor, no bioelectric field, no regenerative tissue. Humans, they explained to their audience in the smooth, patient tones of a nature documentary, compensated for these deficiencies through aggression and an apparent willingness to accept damage that other species found counterproductive. This was presented as evidence of a neurological disorder. Kale had won 11 rounds. What the Keth-Voran narrative never quite managed to account for was the specific way humans got better. Not stronger, humans didn't get stronger in any way that the Harmony Index could meaningfully measure. But Kale had spent 6 months watching other fighters, learning their tells, understanding how the Keth-Voran audience responded to escalation versus endurance, and how the handlers adjusted conditions in the arena in real time to manage the broadcast. He'd learned the arena, not the physical space, the whole system. He was a problem the Harmony Index had not been designed to model. 3 days out, the signal came through. It arrived as a thermal pattern in the nutrient paste, which Cole only noticed because he'd been told to look for it, and he still almost missed it. A sequence of dots and dashes pressed into the surface with something thin and hot. A piece of maintenance wire, probably, handled by someone in the facility's waste heat network, someone who worked a maintenance route. Someone who had looked at the Keth-Voran facility design and found the seam. The message was short. It said, "Round 12 will be a paired fight. You and the one next door. They will expect you to kill him within 4 minutes. Don't," it said. The broadcast node for Facility Cluster 7 is on level 9 of this structure. Maintenance access requires a biometric the Keth-Voran took from every fighter at intake. They kept them in the system because they thought they were keeping them from us. It said, "I'll tell you the rest when you're out. Come find me." It was signed MMS. The man next door was named Blackout. That wasn't his given name. Kale never asked for those anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because names in the games carried a particular weight that could become a liability. But it described him accurately enough. Blackout could generate a localized electromagnetic pulse. Not a large one. Enough to knock out electronics within a 2-meter radius for about 4 seconds, after which his body needed roughly 90 seconds to regenerate the charge. The Keth-Voran had categorized this as a low-threat adaptation and put him in 11 previous rounds, expecting him to lose several of them. He hadn't lost any of them. Kale explained the plan through the membrane seam while they both pretended to sleep. It took 4 hours to get through the full thing because they could only talk during the gaps between guard passes. And those gaps were never longer than 4 minutes. KL had timed them. He'd been timing them for 3 months. Blackout was quiet through most of it. When Kale finished, there was a long pause and then, "You trust her." "I trust the math," Kale said. 43 people out of Kessler Station. Whoever figured out the maintenance frequency, whoever got that message into the nutrient paste past 3 layers of handler screening, that's not someone working on hope. Another pause. "You've been planning to get out this whole time." "I've been paying attention this most," Kale said. "Getting out is what happens if you pay attention long enough." Blackout made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't not one either. 11 rounds, he said. You must be very patient. I grew up in a colony on a tidal-locked rock, Kale said. You get patient or you go insane. The arena was a sphere. It was always a sphere. The Keth Foran had learned early that enclosed spaces produced the most dramatic broadcasts because fighters couldn't simply refuse to engage. The walls were smooth and curved, and the lighting came from everywhere at once, which meant there were no shadows and no way to gauge depth at a distance. KL had spent 11 rounds learning to navigate by relative motion instead. Another thing the Harmony Index had not been designed to account for. He walked out into the sphere, and Blackout walked out from the opposite entry point, and the crowd noise came through the broadcast mesh in the walls. A composite rendering of the reaction from 42 star systems. Compressed and delivered in real time, the Kethvoran were very proud of this technology. It meant the audience could feel collectively present for every death. Kale rolled his shoulders. He looked across the sphere at Blackout, who was a broad man with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin, and an expression that was currently doing a reasonably good impression of hostile indifference. They had never met in person. This was the first time Kale had seen his face. He gave a single, small nod. Blackout returned it. What followed was what Kale privately thought of as a conversation, not the kind the Keth Voron commentators were narrating over the broadcast. They were describing aggression patterns and threat assessments, and the particular fascinating brutality of paired human combat. What was actually happening was two people who had talked through a membrane seam for 3 days moving around a spheres in complete coordination, creating the appearance of a fight whilst conserving every joule of energy for what came next. They knew what the arena cameras tracked. They knew what movements registered as high intensity. They knew that the handlers watching the broadcast feeds were looking for the pattern that suggested a fight was approaching its climax, and that when that pattern registered, they began reducing the arena oxygen by 2% in preparation for post-match protocol. When Kale felt the air thin slightly, something he'd learned to detect around round 6, he looked at Blackout and touched his own left ear. Blackout closed his eyes. The pulse hit. 4 seconds of darkness and dead electronics in a 2-meter sphere around Blackout's body. The arena cameras lost their feed. The broadcast mesh went silent. The handler's monitoring station registered an anomaly and began running diagnostics. 90 seconds, minimum, before the anomaly resolved, and the cameras came back. Kale was already at the wall. The access panel was behind the camera mount. He'd seen its outline in round 8, and spent 3 rounds figuring out how to get to it during a match without triggering the proximity alert, which was keyed to motion rather than presence. Meaning, if you moved slowly enough, it didn't care that you were there. He'd been moving toward this wall for 4 rounds, slowly enough that no single match contained enough motion data to flag. His own biometric was in the Keth Voran system. He pressed his palm against the panel. The panel opened. Level 9 was cold and smelled like ozone and running coolant, and every junction in the maintenance corridor looked exactly like every other junction, which was either a design philosophy or a security measure or both. Kale moved through it by the map he had memorized from Solis's message, which he had eaten after reading it, because that had seemed prudent, and also because the nutrient paste had genuinely improved flavor by comparison. Blackout was behind him, regenerating his charge with each step, moving with the particular focused silence of a man who had decided to do a thing and was no longer spending energy on whether it was possible. The broadcast node was a column of equipment that filled a room the size of a cargo bay. Kale stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something that might have been joy. Not because of what it was, because of what it could be made to do. The Kethvoran had built the Mortality Games broadcast to flow one direction, from the arena to the audience. 42 star systems watching, proof of concept, proof of human savagery, proof that there was nothing here worth preserving. The system had an input node. All broadcast systems had input nodes, because systems needed maintenance and updates needed to come from somewhere. The Keth Voran had simply never considered the possibility that someone who understood their system from the inside would use the input node for anything other than its intended purpose. "How long do you need?" Blackout asked. 4 minutes, Kale said. He was already moving. Maybe 3. The next pulse is ready. Save it. Kale paused at the main terminal and looked at the interface. Kethvoran script, which he had been studying for 4 months using contraband translation guides that came through the maintenance frequency in pieces. He could not read all of it. He could read enough. There are handlers on the way. They'll come through the North Junction. I'll be at the North Junction, Blackout said, and turned and walked back into the corridor without further discussion. Cale started working. He wasn't trying to destroy the broadcast. Destroying the broadcast would be satisfying in the immediate term and accomplish nothing in the long term. The Kethvoran would rebuild it in 6 weeks and add security measures and continue. What Cale was doing was different. What Cale was doing was the thing that Mira Solis had apparently spent 4 months building toward. Coordinating across 4 facility clusters, threading signal bursts through waste heat maintenance channels, getting messages into nutrient paste past 3 layers of screening. She wasn't trying to stop the broadcast. She was trying to use it. 42 star systems watching. The Kethvoran had built themselves the largest communications network in this sector of space, and handed it, in their absolute confidence that the thing in the arena was contained, to the things in the arena. Cale pulled up the input node. He connected the drive that had been in the false bottom of his feeding tray for 2 weeks, delivered through the same maintenance route as everything else, waiting for him to be in front of a terminal, waiting for round 12. The drive contained footage, not arena footage, footage from Kessler Station, raw, unedited, taken by someone's personal recorder during the evacuation. It contained humans doing the specific things that humans did when things were impossible. Carrying people who couldn't walk, going back into burning corridors for children they'd never met, making jokes in the dark. Because humor was apparently a thing the human nervous system deployed when terror became too large for any other response. It contained 43 people surviving something that 4,000 people hadn't. It contained Mira Solis, moving through a collapsing station with the particular expression of someone who is not thinking about whether a thing is possible, only about what comes next. It contained the things the Kethvoran narrative about humanity systematically did not contain. Cale uploaded it to the broadcast node. Behind him at the North Junction, he heard the sound of a Kethvoran pulse weapon discharging, and then 4 seconds of silence that had a particular quality, and then voices, and then nothing. He finished the upload. He set the broadcast to interrupt. He stood back from the terminal and looked at it, and thought about a dark sky and grass and his mother's voice and 11 rounds and 7 faces he did not let himself forget. And then he picked up the drive and walked back to the North Junction. Blackout was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and 3 handlers unconscious at his feet. He had a cut above his eye that was bleeding freely and a look on his face that Cale had no previous reference for. "It's running?" Blackout asked. "It's running." 42 star systems. The Kethvoran had wanted proof. They were getting proof. Just not the proof they designed the system to deliver. The way out had been planned by someone who understood that the hardest part of any escape was not getting through the walls. The walls were infrastructure. Infrastructure had maintenance access, blind spots, tolerance thresholds, schedules. The hard part was what you did after you were through the walls. Mira Solis had accounted for that too.